As you're watching this documentary, the first thing we'd like to say is thank you. This project has been our passion, and we made it with no budget. This will go through the recent history documenting the rise of the podcast. We'll start at the very beginning, way back in the 1980s when podcasting first started, but back then it was called audio blogging. This is well before the advent of the World Wide Web. In the 1980s, RCS, or Radio Computing Services, provided music and talk-related software in a digital format. And in the early 1990s, we now started to have radio-style talk shows, but on the computer. And in 1993, Carl Malleman launched Internet Talk Radio, which was the first computer talk radio show, each week interviewing a computer expert. It was described as audio files that computer users fetched one by one. We have to say, what a super snappy name that is. Now, downloading music did not reach critical mass until the launch of Napster, and this helped the mass media get used to the idea of downloading what we want, when we want it. In 2001, Albion Technologies of San Francisco introduced Replay Radio, later renamed Replay AV. This was like a TiVo recorder, but for internet radio shows. The best feature was a direct download link, which would scan the radio publisher's sites for new files and copy them directly to the user's hard disk. The first radio show to publish in this format was Web Talk Guy's World Radio Show, produced by Rob and Dana Greenlee. Okay, let's move on and focus on the podcasters then. When was your first recording session?
My name's Alexia and I'm the host of the Fear-Free Childbirth podcast and the Head Trash Show podcast. I first started podcasting back in 2013, in January of that year, when I launched my very first podcast. But I didn't do it properly at all. It was just such a bad job. I didn't even list it on iTunes. I mean, it was just bad on so many levels. But it was a really great experience for me and enabled me to really find my voice on the mic, which was something that I really needed to do to sort of to get some traction going with podcasting. And so my first podcast was only sort of 12 episodes long. And then I pulled it when I learned more about podcasting and realized that if I was going to do this properly, I had to kind of scratch it out and start again. And so that's when I launched my Head Trash Show podcast in July 2013.
And why did you start a podcast?
I decided to launch a podcast for my Head Trash Show business because I felt it was going to be a really, really powerful way for me to communicate directly with the people that I wanted to speak to. Some of the concepts that I discuss or that are part of my business, which is all about getting rid of all those negative thoughts, feelings and emotions from your mind. I mean, some of that stuff is quite delicate. It's also quite meaty subjects that really covering in a blog post doesn't really do it justice. So for me, the medium of the podcast just seemed perfect for me to kind of build that really strong connection with my audience and my target audience as well, so that they could discover what my work was about and use it so that they could start getting real impact and noticing change in their life. And that's what I found it to be. It proved to be such a great medium for me. And that show is now listened to in over 120 countries around the world. And I've still got people every week signing up to hear more about what I do in that business. So it really has been a really great thing for me to do for the Head Trash business that I have.
When did you feel you were comfortable on the microphone?
I think I first started getting comfortable on the mic in the beginning of the Head Trash Show podcast. So I'd already, maybe sort of in the 5th episode or so. So I'd already done 12 episodes of my first podcast and I'd already done another 5 or so in the Head Trash Show. And that's when I really started to find my confidence, find my voice, and really be okay with speaking to nobody here in my office, just having the mic on and just hitting record. Up until that point, I used a lot of scripts and bullet points, and it, when I listen back, some of those shows feel slightly forced and maybe artificial, whereas now I feel like I've found my flow and I'm able to speak. And also podcasting has forced me to really become more articulate with my language, with speaking, and as a result I've done a lot more public speaking as well. So I really appreciate what I've learned as a result of starting the podcasting journey.
Do you think it's a better medium for content creators than, say, YouTube or Patreon?
I wouldn't say that it's better than YouTube or Patreon for content creators, because I really think it depends on the content creator and what they're comfortable with. For me, it's really easy to podcast because I know all I have to do is press record. I've got 2 little kids and sometimes I don't get much sleep. So the idea of having to put makeup on, do a video, make sure my background's all ready and okay and the house is tidy is just too much of an effort. Whereas for me, hitting record, the house could be chaotic behind me. I've even recorded podcasts with my little 12-month-old. She was in a sling and I just kept her quiet, sleeping while I was recording the podcast, interviewing some guests. And I just wouldn't be able to do that with YouTube. So for me, it works really, really well for those reasons. But some people, YouTube works well for them. So I think it's really important for a content creator to discover a medium that just works for them and maximizes on their own strengths and their own abilities and talents.
For people just starting out, what advice would you give?
If somebody asked me about podcasting now, they're thinking of starting out, the one thing I would really urge them to do is to really be clear about how podcasting is going to fit in with what they're doing with their life. And if it's part of their business, to be really clear about how it's going to add value to their business and what role it's playing within their business. Because podcasting takes a ton of time. There's a lot of effort. There's a lot of preparing that goes into episodes. And that's whether or not that, if you have guests, then you've got to research the guests, put time in, organise the recording, then edit the guest, listen to what's been said. There's, to write up your show notes, there's the writing up of blog posts and show notes. And if you create downloads that go with your episodes as well, then there's the time required to create those. Then there's all the sort of marketing of each episode, so the social media sharing. And so there's a lot of effort that goes into each podcast episode that I'm not sure newbies in the podcasting world really appreciate how much time is required. And so that would be what I would urge people who are considering podcasts to really take a good look at, because if it is really clear for them how it's going to add value to their business, how it's going to fit with other aspects of their business, then I think podcasting can really create a massive impact on the state of your business. But if you're not very clear and you end up getting distracted by it because of the enormous amount of time that it takes, then it could just be the wrong thing for that person to do. So that's what I would urge people to do who are considering looking into podcasting.
Why do you think they've become so popular?
I think podcasts have become so popular because of the smartphone. I mean, I listen to podcasts all the time, and I've always got my phone in my back pocket with a podcast playing while I'm going around the house, getting breakfast ready, getting lunch ready, hanging the washing, cooking. I love listening to podcasts while I'm cooking. When I used to go at the gym, I used to be listening to podcasts all the time at the gym. I've got them in the car. They literally accompany me wherever I go. And I think that's what people find. That's what they love about them. The fact that they can choose what they're going to listen to and when they're going to listen to it. And it's always with them. And there's such a there's just so many to choose from. If there's anything that I'm stuck with in my business and I want to learn something new, then the first thing I do is look for a podcast on it and start learning that way. And then if I need to take my learning deeper, then I'll seek other sources. But the podcast will always be my first port of call now. And I think a lot of people are finding that as well, that they're able to really tap into new areas of knowledge and learn about stuff, get inspired and develop themselves in lots of ways. And also just to hang out and relax by listening to content on podcasts. There are some really great music podcasts, comedy podcasts as well. So there's just so much that podcasts offer that it's no surprise at all to me why they are becoming so popular today.
When you have a guest on your show, how do you prepare for an interview?
All 3 of my podcasts have featured guest interviews alongside the more solo content that I provide. And so I've always had to sort of wrestle with preparing for the guest interview. And it really does depend on the guest as to how I prepare. So some of the guests I've had on, I've known them quite well, or we've developed a relationship over social media that means it's a very relaxed sort of interview, and I've already become quite familiar with a lot of their work through following them or being in the same circles for quite a while. Whereas if there's a new guest where I really don't know anything about them, and maybe they've approached me because they want to come on the podcast, or because I'm researching a topic and I feel that that is going to add value to my audience, then I will spend quite a bit of time trying to get my head around who they are. And if they've launched a book or they've created a film, then I'll definitely dive in and read the book and watch the film. I've interviewed quite a lot of film directors on the Fear-Free Childbirth podcast, so I will spend time watching the material they've created, because I think it's really important to have that perspective when you're speaking to them. So it really does depend on the guest. But having said that, I do not try and over prepare, because I want the conversation to be as relaxed as possible. So it's very rare that I have a load of questions lined up, because I would rather respond to what they're saying to me right there and then, rather than make it sound like I've got this list of questions that I want to ask them. So it's a blend of research and just winging it, to be honest, and that works for me right now. But I dare say if I get a really high profile guest, then I might spend a little bit more time on the preparation and less on the winging it.
Were there any significant low points in your recording thus far?
I think one of the low points for me podcasting was when I just launched my Fear-Free Childbirth podcast. And so now I was running two weekly podcasts with a newborn and a 4-year-old. And it quickly became obvious that this was not sustainable. And so I reached a point where I really had to make a decision that one of them had to be put on hold. And that was really tough for me, because I know from all the emails that I get from my listeners that they love my podcast. And so I had to drop one, and put it on hold. And that was really hard for me to decide which one I would do that with, and how I would handle that with my audience, and how I'd feel about letting them down, because I really don't like letting people down in that way. So that was quite hard for me when I decided to put one of my podcasts on hold. But I was pleased I did it, because it enabled me to focus a lot more of my attention on the one that I stayed with, and that was much better for the long run, because I needed to do it.